Hey guys, you're back with The Last Climb. Today's story is about a Karen who decided she did not need to carry the extra oxygen because it was unnecessary and slowing her down. And the crazy part is, a traffic jam near the death zone was about to turn that choice into a much bigger problem, one that would slowly rob her brain of oxygen. It was Sunday, July 22nd, 2018. On the Pakistani side of the Karakoram Range, a cluster of tents sat scattered across a stretch of loose rock and old glacier ice, right beneath the second highest mountain on Earth. Climbers who'd been coming to this range for years called this particular peak one of the most dangerous 8,000-meter mountains to attempt to actually stand on top of, not because it was the tallest, but because its history was full of climbers who reached the summit and never returned to base camp. The weather window for a summit attempt here usually only opens for a handful of days each season, sometimes less, which means once conditions turn favorable, almost every team on the mountain pushes for the top at roughly the same time. Denise Bowman was 48 years old and worked as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company in Denver, Colorado. She had been putting money aside for this climb for nearly 2 years. Her company eventually covered part of the cost after she presented it as a fit for a wellness campaign they were running that year. She booked with a mid-sized expedition company that handled the permits, transportation, camps, and climbing logistics, but did not operate like one of the larger full-service teams on the mountain. The guides still ran briefings and equipment checks, but climbers were expected to keep track of their own assigned gear and follow the instructions they were given. She'd been climbing for about 6 years by that point, starting with shorter peaks in her home state before moving up to a couple of 6,000-meter climbs in South America. On one of those earlier climbs, she developed a mild headache and nausea partway up, symptoms consistent with altitude sickness, but pushed through it and reached the summit anyway. She talked about that climb a few times on this trip, usually when someone brought up taking things slow. In the months leading up to this trip, she trained by climbing stairwells in her office building with a weighted pack on, sometimes more than once a day, keeping a running log of her times and trying to beat her previous best each week. She also spent a fair amount of time going through her gear list, cutting items out one at a time, deciding what she could manage without in order to keep her pack as light as possible for the climb. I have to admit, keeping personal records for climbing the stairs at work is a level of commitment I definitely do not bring to the average Tuesday. The team she'd signed on with was made up of climbers from 4 different countries, along with a small group of local high-altitude guides and support climbers who handled most of the technical rope work and load carrying. Before the climb began, local staff gathered the team near base camp for a short prayer ceremony for safe passage, a practice some Karakoram teams observe before moving higher. Denise joined the rest of the climbers while the local staff led the prayer. Above roughly 26,000 feet, climbers call it the death zone, and the name isn't for effect. At that altitude, the air holds only about a third of the oxygen available at sea level. The human body cannot adjust to it no matter how much time is spent up there. Cells stop getting what they need, and the body starts breaking down its own muscle for fuel just to keep functioning. Appetite disappears almost completely. Sleep becomes nearly impossible, even lying still in a tent, and the heart works far harder than normal even when a person isn't moving at all. When people picture a climber running low on oxygen, they usually imagine it happening because they were pushing too hard uphill. But at that height, even waiting in place costs you. Your body is still trying to stay warm, keep your heart working, and pull enough air into your lungs. The cylinder keeps draining whether you are climbing or clipped to a rope, standing in line behind someone else. That is why the guides plan oxygen for the full trip above camp, including the descent. The setup is simple. A mask over the nose and mouth connects by a hose to a metal cylinder in the pack. A small regulator controls the flow. Before the summit push, the guides choose that flow rate based on the route, the expected pace, and the number of hours each climber is likely to be out. On a mountain like this, a climber may use several cylinders across the full summit push and descent. Some are carried, some are staged at higher camps, and some are changed over at planned points on the route. Extra cylinders do not always have to sit inside the client's own pack. On guided climbs, a support climber may carry a spare bottle for the person they're assisting. What matters is that the bottle stays close enough to be reached when the planned change comes. Because a delay, a damaged regulator, or a slower than planned descent can turn a normal oxygen plan into a short one very quickly. I almost think of that extra bottle like carrying a spare tire. Most of the time it feels like dead weight, right up until the exact moment you would give just about anything to have it within reach. Each climbing season, before any of the client teams arrive at high camp, a small advance crew goes up ahead of everyone else to anchor rope along the standard route, fixing lines through the same technical sections every team will use that year. It's why so many unrelated teams end up funneling through the exact same narrow points on the mountain. The route here has a section climbers refer to simply as the bottleneck, a narrow, ice-choked passage that sits directly beneath a wall of hanging glacier ice. Nearly every team attempting the summit has to pass through it single file on that same fixed rope, and because of the terrain, there's no way to speed through it or go around it. It's one of the busiest and slowest points on the entire route, especially when multiple teams are pushing for the summit on the same night. It's strange that one of the biggest problems on a mountain this remote can basically be traffic. Now you travel halfway around the world to somewhere almost nobody can survive, and then end up waiting in line because everyone has to squeeze through the same few feet of ice. Denise's support climber, the man assigned to carry gear and assist her personally on summit day, had worked high-altitude expeditions in the Karakoram for more than a decade and had been on K2 during several summit seasons. It was the kind of experience that meant he generally knew when something on the mountain was going the way it should and when it wasn't. About 2 weeks before the summit window opened, during one of the earliest acclimatization rotations, a sudden snow squall rolled in while Denise's group was partway up toward a lower camp, cutting visibility down to almost nothing within minutes. The guide made the call to turn the group back rather than push through it, and they spent an extra 2 days at base camp waiting for conditions to clear before trying that rotation again. Denise didn't argue with the decision at the time, but she brought it up more than once afterward as an example of how much time the trip had already lost. 2 days probably sounds small when you hear it from home. When you've spent years planning one narrow weather window on the other side of the world, I can see how 48 hours could start feeling enormous. On the rotation that followed, the guide showed Denise how to settle into a slow, deliberate breathing rhythm on steep ground, matching her breaths to her steps instead of rushing through short, shallow breaths. Denise used it through the rest of the rotation and said it helped her keep a steadier pace. That same rotation, the guide told Denise she needed to take a scheduled rest day before heading higher, the same as everyone else on the team. She said she felt fine and was not going to waste a clear day sitting in camp when she could be making progress. The guide explained that the rest day was part of the acclimatization plan, not something climbers could skip because they felt strong that morning. He told her she would not be allowed to move to the next camp until the recovery period was complete. Denise stayed in camp, but spent much of the day reorganizing her gear and repeatedly asking when the next carry would begin. Waiting is probably one of the hardest skills to train for on a trip like this. You can spend months getting stronger, faster, and better with the equipment, but there is no treadmill that teaches you how to sit still while perfect climbing weather disappears outside the tent. A few days later, the summit window that had originally been forecast got pushed back by nearly a week due to high winds reported near the summit ridge. Waiting around base camp for that long wears on people, and Denise wasn't shy about saying so. She commented to a few people that other teams on the mountain seemed to be wasting less time than their group was, even though the delay was coming from the same weather system for everyone on that side of the mountain. During that same waiting period, another climber on a different team had a minor issue with his oxygen regulator during a short rotation above camp. Nothing serious, just a stuck valve that got sorted out once he got back down. Denise watched part of that unfold from a distance, and later told a teammate it was probably just user error, adding that she'd read enough about the equipment to know how to avoid a problem like that herself. Around the same time, the guide pulled Denise aside to go over her summit day plan again. He had noticed she often moved ahead of her assigned pace group during the earlier rotations. He told her that starting too fast high on the mountain can catch up with a climber later, once the air gets thinner and the route gets harder. Denise told him she had trained for the climb, knew how to manage her own pace, and was not going to hold herself back just to wait for slower people. The night before the summit push, the whole team gathered at high camp for a final briefing, where the guide went over oxygen protocol with everyone at once. He reminded them that their working bottles and backups had to remain accounted for and close enough to reach at the planned change points, whether the spare was carried personally or by an assigned support climber. Later, during the individual gear check, he went through his list with each climber one at a time, confirming supplies. When he got to Denise's oxygen plan specifically, he reminded her that her second cylinder needed to remain close enough for a quick change once they reached the planned switch point. Denise, checking a weather update on her phone at the time, told him it was fine and that she had it handled. Earlier that afternoon, before the final briefing, Denise had asked her support climber to carry the extra cylinder. Having him carry a spare bottle was not automatically unusual, but Denise wanted it off her own back because she felt the weight had been slowing her down on the steep carries. She told him to keep it until the planned change or until she asked for it sooner. Having someone else carry the bottle was not the dangerous part by itself. The problem was that once Denise handed it over, whether she could reach that oxygen now depended on that support climber staying close. The check that night was verbal and visual, not a full unpacking of every climber's gear. The guide confirmed that Denise's oxygen allocation was accounted for, and could see that her support climber had the extra bottle assigned to her. With him expected to stay close behind Denise, that arrangement was workable. What the guide did not establish was how quickly the cylinder could actually be pulled from the support climber's pack if the two of them became separated. The guides on that rotation weren't only responsible for Denise. Each one had 2 or 3 clients to track at once that night, checking oxygen, checking pace, checking rope clips, spread across a long line of headlamps moving up the mountain in the dark. It meant no single client got constant, uninterrupted attention once the group was strung out on the route. Summit Day started a little after midnight, in the dark, with a long line of headlamps moving up the fixed ropes above the highest camp, sitting at roughly a little above 25,000 feet. The first 2 hours went the way they were supposed to. Around 2 in the morning, the guide made a routine radio check with each climber in his group, confirming everyone's oxygen was flowing correctly at a fixed rock feature partway up the route. Denise confirmed hers was working fine, which, at that point, it was. Not everyone continued past that point. One climber on a different team, roped in not far from Denise's group, turned back around 3 in the morning after telling his guide he just didn't feel right. Nothing specific, just enough that he didn't want to keep going. He made it back down to high camp without incident. It's worth pointing out, because turning around was always an option that night, for anyone who felt it was the right call. By around 3 in the morning, the group had reached the base of the bottleneck, the narrow ice passage beneath the hanging glacier wall. Multiple teams had converged on that same stretch of fixed rope at once, and to make things slower still, a handful of climbers who had turned around higher on the route, along with a few who were already descending after earlier summit attempts, were coming back through the same passage, forcing climbers going up and climbers coming down to somehow share one narrow line of rope. What should have been a controlled, steady passage turned into more than an hour of waiting and stop-start movement, clipped into a single line while climbers ahead worked through one at a time. Wind picked up during that wait, cutting straight down the passage, and the temperatures were already well below zero, and the wind through the passage made it feel far colder. Someone farther up the line got tangled at a rope junction, and word of the delay passed backward through the group in short bursts over the radios the guides were carrying. Most of it just climbers asking how much longer and getting the same answer, that it would clear when it cleared. A guide from a different team, also stuck in that same line that morning, said afterward that it was one of the worst backups he'd seen at that passage in several seasons, with climbers from at least 4 separate teams packed onto the same stretch of rope at once. Denise's support climber, carrying her backup cylinder, ended up several climbers behind her once the line bunched up at the bottleneck. Neither of them had much control over that. Once a group gets strung out single file through a passage that narrow, with climbers coming the other direction on the same rope, there's no room to pass, and no way to close a gap until the terrain opens back up on the other side. Their oxygen plan assumed the two of them would reconnect once the route opened beyond the bottleneck. Denise was supposed to stay on her first cylinder through that section, then make the planned bottle change after the traverse became wide enough for her support climber to reach her. The long delay and the gap that opened between them meant she remained on that first bottle much longer than the plan had allowed for. The entire time the group stood waiting, Denise's first cylinder kept running at its set flow rate even though she was barely gaining elevation, on a fixed flow system. The important part was the clock. Oxygen continued leaving the cylinder, whether she was climbing or clipped to the rope waiting. Every extra minute in that queue ate into the supply she had expected to carry her to the planned change point. By the time the line finally began moving freely again, Denise had spent far longer than planned on that first cylinder, while the bottle meant for the next stage was still several climbers behind her. Once the line finally cleared the bottleneck, Denise moved out onto the upper traverse beneath the summit ridge. The route opened up slightly there, but it was still steep, exposed, and above 26,000 feet. Her support climber was still several people behind her with the extra cylinder in his pack. And this is where that choice starts catching up with her. A few people on a rope does not sound like much until the thing you need is suddenly out of reach. So what does it actually look like when a climber's oxygen supply starts falling behind what the body needs? It doesn't happen all at once, and for a while, it doesn't look like much of anything. Past 5 in the morning, as the group worked across a long traverse below the summit ridge, a climber a short distance ahead of her later said Denise asked her how much farther it was to the next rope anchor, and then asked the same question again less than a minute later, seeming to have no memory of already asking. It can be an early sign that a climber is no longer thinking clearly at that altitude. When the brain is not getting enough oxygen, a person can hear an answer, understand it in the moment, and then lose track of it almost immediately afterward. A little further along the same traverse, that same climber noticed Denise struggling to clip a carabiner at a rope transition, missing the gate 2 or 3 times before finally getting it closed. Fine motor control tends to go early under hypoxia. It isn't a lack of effort. The body starts prioritizing basic survival functions ahead of precise hand movement once oxygen levels drop far enough. Not long after, Denise's support climber tried to reach her over the radio and called forward through the line to ask how she was doing. When she answered, her words came slower than normal, and they did not quite match the question he had asked. That kind of confusion isn't about effort or focus. It happens because the brain can't process incoming information fast enough to keep up with a normal exchange once it's running short on oxygen. That's such a nasty part of hypoxia to me. The organ you'd normally rely on to notice something is seriously wrong is the same one becoming less capable of noticing it. Around this same point, people close enough to Denise could hear that her breathing had become louder and more labored, even as her pace continued to slow. The body will often try to compensate for low oxygen by breathing harder and faster. But past a certain point, that faster breathing doesn't actually pull in more usable oxygen, it just burns more energy the body doesn't have to spare. A few minutes later, her pace had slowed enough that the gap behind her began closing on its own. She started setting her feet unevenly on a stretch of firm snow, pausing before steps that normally would not have needed a second look. At that point, low oxygen was affecting more than her speech and memory. Balance and depth perception can start to break down because the brain is no longer getting clear, steady signals from the eyes and inner ear about where the ground is. At that altitude, the people around Denise could not have known exactly what combination of problems they were seeing. Severe hypoxia can cause confusion, poor coordination, slowed speech, and trouble walking. But similar deterioration can also appear with serious altitude illness, exhaustion, and hypothermia. What mattered on the rope was simpler. Denise was no longer moving or responding normally. Cold, wind, dehydration, exhaustion, and the amount of time she was spending nearly motionless also increased the risk of frostbite once her pace collapsed. Denise's support climber tried calling to her by radio around this time and got nothing back, not even the short, off-pace answers she'd been giving a few minutes earlier. How much longer could her body keep compensating before something gave out completely? A few moments later, Denise stopped moving on the upper traverse, near an exposed edge of the ridge. Her assigned support climber was still farther down the fixed rope and tried to reach her over the radio. She did not answer clearly. Then her knees buckled and she dropped onto the packed snow beside the line. It was not a long fall. She simply could not stay on her feet anymore. Her assigned support climber reached her within a few minutes. Her exposed skin had turned pale and blue-gray in the cold. Her breathing was so shallow that the support climber had trouble seeing or hearing it through the mask. He tried to check for a pulse through her glove and at her wrist, but in the cold and wind he could not get a reliable reading. The support climber radioed the guide as soon as he reached Denise. The first call did not go straight to high camp. It had to be passed from one guide to another along the route because the ridge blocked a clear signal, and radios at that height often cut in and out. At base camp, staff were already listening to radio traffic from several teams spread across the mountain. The call about Denise came through among updates on the bottleneck, climbers turning around and teams still moving toward the summit. The message was simple. A climber was down on the upper traverse, just beyond the bottleneck, unresponsive and needing oxygen and additional help. The guide stayed on the radio with Denise's support climber, while the response team got moving from high camp. He told him to keep her clipped securely to the fixed line, clear snow from around her mask, protect her from the wind as much as he could, and run the backup oxygen at the emergency rate while the response team climbed up. And there it finally was. The bottle Denise had chosen to put on someone else's back. The problem was that it only reached her after she was already down. At that altitude, fast doesn't mean what it would lower on the mountain. The nearest team capable of responding was still stationed below the technical section, and putting together a response meant gathering a spare oxygen cylinder and enough rope to rig a lowering line back through the same narrow, fixed terrain that had slowed the entire group earlier that night, since the ground there was too steep and broken up for any kind of sled or wheeled equipment. The responders had to pace their own climb carefully as well, since pushing too hard on their own limited oxygen supply to move faster could have left them in the same condition Denise was already in. Blowing snow had reduced visibility across the ridge by that point too, so every step of the response had to be taken carefully, roped in, headlamps barely cutting through the weather. By the time additional support reached her position, a significant amount of time had passed since she went down. Her support climber had stayed with her the entire time, getting a small amount of supplemental oxygen onto her from the backup cylinder he'd been carrying and trying to keep her warm with an extra layer from his own pack, but her condition never improved. Getting Denise back toward high camp became a slow, uncertain process. The team could only move her short distances at a time, securing her to the fixed line, lowering her through the steeper sections, then stopping to reset the ropes before trying again. Where the terrain widened, they shared her weight between them, but even that was difficult in the wind and thin air. They eventually reached high camp, where Denise was pronounced dead. By that point, climbers farther down the route had started hearing radio traffic about a woman who had gone down near the bottleneck. A couple of groups still climbing toward the passage turned around rather than continue higher. Other teams were already well above it, with their own oxygen plans and descent timelines underway, so they continued to the summit and came back through later that day. Denise's team was still spread out below the ridge when the guide made the decision for them. They turned around and returned to high camp without continuing their summit attempt. Bringing her body the rest of the way down the mountain took longer than the initial response. Recovery teams had to wait for a clear weather window before they could safely move a body through the same technical terrain that had slowed everyone else that night, and it was several days before she was brought down to base camp. The later review concluded that Denise died following severe hypoxia and an altitude-related collapse at extreme altitude with cold exposure and the minor fall contributing. Her empty working cylinder, the delay at the bottleneck, and the fact that her extra cylinder was still in her support climber's pack all matched the timeline from the route. The confusion, poor coordination, and disorientation reported before her collapse were consistent with severe oxygen deprivation and altitude-related deterioration. The fall itself was considered secondary, while prolonged cold exposure also contributed to her condition. Radio logs from that night, along with her support climber's account, showed that her second cylinder never reached her before she went down. The bottleneck delay had separated the two of them, and the crowded fixed line prevented her support climber from closing that gap before her first cylinder ran out. Her first cylinder was recovered a short distance from where she fell, its gauge reading empty, while her second cylinder was recovered from her support climber's pack once he made it down, showing only the small amount used, trying to help her after he reached her side. The guide's check sheet showed that Denise had been assigned the extra cylinder and had confirmed that her oxygen setup was ready before the climb began. The case was reviewed and treated as an accidental high-altitude death, with the oxygen shortfall, prolonged delay, separation from her backup supply, extreme altitude, and cold all contributing to the collapse. If you liked today's episode, go ahead and click like. You want to comment? Let's talk about it. Come on, I love talking. Also, be sure you subscribe. I know a bunch of you are watching these videos, you haven't subscribed yet. Come on.